Last week I made a Eldritch Abomination for greed, and this week I decided to go for an Eldritch Abomination of gluttony. Deciding the exact design was a little rough, but I decided to go for a pig head fixed upon a monkey's body. This is the monkey form that assists in survival, and capability combined with the pig head very obviously representing gluttony. Now, the exacts of gluttony make for weird monsters, but generally speaking, it's associated with taking more than your share and screwing over everyone else, and it's very closely tied to greed. Additionally, I thought it'd be fun to give them an extra trait, so they are a dream-like entity that have a wavery and inconsistent form as a result. They do not start in the material plane, they start in a world of dreams. They must figure out a direct hole in reality to the material plane. They will normally do this through a human who is particularly gluttonous, which I'll get to in a second. Now, you might be wondering how these beings came to be. If there's a deity of dreams in your setting, I would tie them to her. I would have her cursed into a mortal form for a brief period of time, and then you have a man refuse to provide her food during that time. And then when she comes back to her full deity form, she curses him, either making him the first one or making them separate, and they go in and they screw him over. Now, I suppose I should start with how these creatures come to become your enemy. Picture a starving town. Many are on the ground dying of famine. And then there is one guy that has not just enough food to make it through the winter, but enough food to feed everyone else. Now, you might wonder how this happens. In good seasons, you can actually get a lot of food together, and particularly successful farmers historically were more than capable of getting enough to last several years in advance, assuming they didn't sell it. So they were regularly thinking about, do I sell the wheat now or do I save it for the future? If a farmer is successful several years in a row, they could get enough food for themselves and probably a family or two through a winter in a particularly harsh season. Grain stores really well, so as long as there's not a rat problem, this could happen with a relatively low frequency throughout a setting. It could also readjust how people view their food stores, because stories of my monster, which I'll get to in a second, would spread throughout the land, so many of them would be very careful to try not to overstore their supplies, especially when they start getting the warning signs. The first warning signs are his dreams being filled with the desire for that food, and it increases and it increases. And in their dreams, they grow hungry despite everything that they eat. And then the creatures start to emerge. They'll show up to these fellows in visions, little flashes, you know, ghost story style, until eventually their store of food suddenly vanishes as they have finally figured out the passage into the material plane. Now, this screws over the one guy, but then it also releases a small handful of these monstrous creatures that are now obsessed with obtaining more food. And if you're a clever fellow, you will notice that there's not a ton to go around. It was at this point in editing that I realized I needed a better base model. I picture an adventure about the creature would go something like this. The players arrive at a town. They see that much of the town is in desperate need of food and very hungry. After asking around, they discover that the creatures have been rampaging for a while, and they have to figure out how to put a stop to it. Fairly straightforward adventure with a thrown-in twist that they come from a dreamlike reality. So what you need to do to actually prevent the flow is to kill off the source of the dreams. This would be the man that dreamt of famine, or perhaps less ethically questionable is some sort of portal to get into the dreamland. This portal could be made of a number of things. I'm imagining some sort of crystal set up in a ritual format around bits of the monster's flesh. Now, the monsters would have their own sets of habits and a language. The exacts of the language would be a little vague, but I imagine it would mostly be snarls and grunts and oinks and whatnot, and could be very frustrating for a set of players that don't have a means of magical translation. I also imagine the habits might consist of cannibalize each other. They might set up ambushes, and they would do many things, but their priority would and always will be food. They would also learn to start eating humans, of course, and that's its own rampage, but would wait to do this step until after all other food supply in the area has run out. So you're on a ticking time bomb, until boom, they start wiping out the population. You could populate an abandoned villages like this. Imagine your party's moving into an area and suddenly there stops being enough food to forage, and it gets harder and harder to find resources, and then they find this village. And the village isn't burned, it's not ruined, but there's just skeletons around. It's not clear what killed them besides some gnawing on their bones. And all the wealth is still there. There's literally nothing missing except for the food of the village. It could be a pretty interesting sight, followed by an encounter with one of these creatures. I don't imagine they would set themselves up in groups larger than 20, and I'd spread those out, so you're defeating 20 or so of them over the course of an adventure. But whenever you kill one, it'll go into the dream realm and come back. You have to go to the dream realm to permanently slay it. We could also make them more natural creatures, in which case we should give thought to their intelligence. I want to set them at about goblin level, as in not as smart as humans, but they can communicate, talk, what have you. In that vein, I would set them up in kind of tribes that will work for anyone who will provide food. This is often why they could end up as cannon fodder for bugbear or hobgoblin groups, but they could also end up as the source of power for humans or other people who are capable of providing it. I could imagine them taking a role similar to the hyenas in The Lion King, where they're taking food in exchange for a evil dictator of sorts. This could make an interesting adventure where instead of directly attacking your enemy, you actually just cut off their supply lines, and as their supply starts to dwindle, the creatures inside eventually turn on the population and wipe most of them out. This would require a bit more planning and finesse. It's difficult to communicate smart plans to players, and I could view the evil entities getting very desperate towards the end and maybe even taking a preemptive strike to wipe out the creatures first, but you still remove a good chunk of their armies. Their weaponry would probably mostly be tribal instruments. You get your wooden spears, maybe some bows, you know, whatever could feasibly be made at like a low technology level. But if they're equipped by another force, they could get very deadly very quickly. This is how I like to play goblins. I don't like goblins with scimitars. What you need to do is you need to give them wooden spears, bows, and clubs. And then whenever you want to make them a threat, you have someone else give them serious weaponry. We could also tie them to a plane of existence. I could picture them being some sort of chaotic neutral entity that drifts in from other planes. It could actually be fun to make them like a natural enemy of our lawful good clock people, because suddenly now we have pig monkeys fighting clock people, and that's just a fun encounter. We could also give them stuff to barter with. So let's say they're bartering with a group of humans. They would likely be trading whatever resources they have for food. So you could even do something like a group of humans needs their gold mines dug. So what they do is, instead of, you know, our historical humans dug gold mines, you get a bunch of farms going, and then you get these guys, and then they act as your manual labor. And before we leave, let me give some honorable mentions to these absolute demons that my AI kept generating.